Why you wouldn't last a day in the age of the Crusades. The sun rose over the medieval landscape on a morning in the year 1095. The year 1095 was in the 11th century. Centuries are periods of 100 years. The 11th century includes the years from 1001 to 1100. The year 1095 falls within this range. This is a mathematical fact that can be verified through simple arithmetic. The medieval period, also called the Middle Ages, lasted from approximately the 5th century to the 15th century. Different historians define the exact boundaries slightly differently. Some begin the medieval period with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. Others use different markers. The end of the medieval period is sometimes placed at the fall of Constantinople in 1453, or at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation in 1517, or at other significant events. Periodization is the process of dividing history into named periods. This is done for convenience and to help organize historical knowledge. However, people living during these periods did not think of themselves as living at the Middle Ages. This term was invented later by scholars looking back at history. The people of the time simply lived their lives without awareness that future historians would categorize their era in a particular way. On this particular morning in 1095, in a small village somewhere in France, a peasant named Guillaume woke up. Guillaume is a French name. It is the French form of the name William. Many people in medieval France were named Guillaume. This Guillaume was one of many, distinguished from others only by his individual existence, and perhaps by a surname indicating his father's name, or his village, or his occupation. Guillaume slept on a simple bed. The bed consisted of a wooden frame with rope or leather straps stretched across it. On top of this would be placed a mattress stuffed with straw. Straw is the dried stalks of grain plants after the grain has been harvested. It is lightweight and was readily available in agricultural communities. However, straw compresses over time and provides less cushioning as it ages. The mattress would need to be restuffed periodically. This restuffing would typically be done annually, perhaps in the autumn after the harvest when fresh straw was abundant. The old straw would be removed and could be used for animal bedding or composted. New straw would be stuffed into the mattress cover. This was a routine household task. Guillaume's house was small. Most peasant houses in medieval Europe were small, consisting of perhaps 1 or 2 rooms. The houses were made of materials that were locally available. In some regions, this meant wood. In others, it meant stone. In many areas, houses were made with a technique called wattle and daub. Wattle and daub is a building technique. First, a framework of wooden stakes is created. These stakes are called wattles. Then, horizontal branches or strips of wood are woven between the vertical stakes, creating a lattice. This lattice is then covered with daub, which is a mixture of mud, clay, animal dung and straw. When the daub dries, it creates a solid wall. The advantages of wattle and daub construction include that the materials are inexpensive and locally available. The disadvantages include that the structures are not very durable and require regular maintenance. Rain can erode the daub. The wood can rot. Insects can damage the structure. Regular repairs would be necessary to maintain a wattle and daub house. Guillaume's house had a thatched roof. Thatching is a roofing technique that uses dried vegetation, typically straw or reeds. The vegetation is bundled and layered on the roof in overlapping rows. When properly installed, a thatched roof can shed water effectively because water runs down the sloped, overlapping vegetation rather than penetrating through to the interior. However, thatched roofs have disadvantages. They are flammable. A single spark from a cooking 12 to 14 hours of work. In winter, when days are short, the workday would be correspondingly shorter. However, winter was not a time of rest for medieval peasants. Although less field work could be done when the ground was frozen or covered with snow, there were still many tasks to complete. Animals needed to be fed and cared for. Tools needed to be maintained and repaired. There was spinning, weaving, and other craft work to produce clothing and other necessities. The medieval agricultural year was a cycle of different tasks. In autumn, fields were ploughed and winter crops were sown. In winter, there was relatively less field work but much indoor work. In spring, fields were ploughed again, and spring crops were sown. In summer, crops grew and required weeding and other maintenance. In late summer and autumn, crops were harvested. Then the cycle repeated. Each of these tasks required different skills and different levels of effort. Harvest time was particularly intense because crops needed to be gathered quickly once they were ripe. Delay could result in crops being damaged by weather or eaten by birds and animals. All available labour, including women and children, would be mobilized during harvest. Guillaume's wife, whose name might have been Agnès because Agnès was a common name for women in medieval France, would also work in the fields during busy times. However, women typically had additional responsibilities for household work. This included cooking, cleaning, caring for children, spinning and weaving, making and repairing clothing, tending to vegetable gardens and animals, and many other tasks. The division of labour between men and women in medieval peasant households was flexible and practical rather than rigid. Both men and women did whatever work was necessary. However, some tasks were more typically done by one sex or the other. Heavy field work like ploughing was usually done by men. Spinning thread was usually done by women. But these were tendencies rather than absolute rules. Children also worked from a young age. As soon as children were old enough to perform simple tasks, they would be put to work. Young children might gather kindling for fires, fetch water, watch younger siblings, or chase birds away from crops. As children grew older, they would gradually take on more complex and physically demanding tasks. Formal education was rare for peasant children. There were no public schools in medieval villages. Literacy was limited primarily to clergy and some nobles. Peasant children learned by observing and helping their parents. They learned farming techniques, craft skills, and social knowledge through this informal apprenticeship. The vast majority of medieval people were illiterate. They could not read or write. This did not mean they were unintelligent or ignorant. They possessed extensive practical knowledge about agriculture, weather, animals, plants, and many other topics relevant to their lives. However, they could not access knowledge recorded in books. Books themselves were rare and expensive in medieval times. Before the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, books had to be copied by hand. This was time-consuming and required skill. Books were usually copied by monks in monasteries. A single book might take months to copy. Therefore, books were precious objects owned primarily by churches monasteries, and wealthy individuals. The content of books was also limited. Many books were religious texts, including the Bible and writings of church fathers. There were also books on law, medicine, philosophy, and some literature. However, the total number of books in all of Europe in the 11th century was far smaller than the number of books published in a single year in modern times. This means that knowledge transmission in medieval society was primarily oral rather than written. People learned by listening and observing rather than by reading. Stories, traditions, skills and beliefs, the animal. Then an enzyme called rennet is added to the milk. Rennet causes the milk proteins to coagulate, forming curds. The liquid portion, called whey, is separated from the curds. The curds are then pressed to remove more whey and to form the cheese into a solid mass. The cheese may then be aged for varying periods of time. Different types of cheese result from variations in this process. The type of milk used, the specific bacteria or molds introduced, the length of aging, and other factors all affect the final product. Medieval peasants would have made simple cheeses. More complex aged cheeses were luxury items. In addition to bread and possibly cheese, Guillaume might drink something with his breakfast. Water would be the most obvious choice, but water quality was often poor in medieval times. Sources of water could be contaminated with waste, leading to waterborne diseases. For this reason, people often drank other beverages. Ale was a common drink in medieval northern Europe. Ale is similar to beer but is made without hops. It is produced by fermenting grain, usually barley. The fermentation process involves yeast, which are single-celled fungi. Yeast cells consume sugars into grain and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide as byproducts. Medieval ale was weaker in alcohol content than modern beer, typically around 2 to 3% alcohol by volume. It was consumed by adults and children alike as a daily beverage. The brewing process involves boiling the water, which kills disease-causing organisms, making ale safer to drink than untreated water, even though medieval people did not understand the reason for this. After eating breakfast, Guillaume would need to go to work. Work for a medieval peasant meant agricultural labour. The medieval economy was primarily agricultural. Most people worked in farming. They grew crops and raised animals to provide food for themselves and for the rest of society. Guillaume was not a free landowner. He was a serf. Serfdom was a condition of bondage that was common in medieval Europe. Serfs were not slaves, who could be bought and sold freely, but serfs were not free either. They were bound to the land they worked. They could not leave without permission from the lord who owned the land. In exchange for the right to work a plot of land for their own subsistence, serfs owed various obligations to their lord. These obligations typically included working a certain number of days per week on the lord's fields, called domain. They might also owe a portion of their own harvest to the lord. They might owe other services such as repairing roads or buildings on the lord's estate. This system is called feudalism or manorialism, though historians debate the precise definitions and whether these terms are useful. The basic structure involved a hierarchy of obligations. Peasants owed service to local lords. Local lords owed service to higher nobles. Higher nobles owed service to the king. The king, in theory, received authority from God. This hierarchical structure was seen as natural and divinely ordained in medieval thinking. Different people had different positions in society based on birth. and these positions came with different rights and responsibilities. Social mobility was limited. A person born a serf would almost certainly die a serf. A person born a noble would remain a noble. Guillaume walked to the fields. The fields were located outside the village. Medieval agriculture often used an open field system. Large fields were divided into strips. Each peasant family would farm several strips scattered throughout the different fields. This distribution was meant to ensure fairness, so no family had only the best or only the worst land. The fields were planted on a rotation schedule. A common system was 3-field rotation. One field would be planted with a winter crop like winter wheat or rye, sown in autumn and harvested in summer. One field would be planted with a spring crop like oats or barley, sown in spring and harvested in late summer or autumn. The third field would lie fallow, meaning it would not be planted but would be left to rest. Letting fields lie fallow helps restore soil fertility. Growing crops depletes nutrients in the soil. Allowing a field to rest, possibly with grazing animals on it whose manure would add nutrients, helps restore the soil. The 3 fields would rotate each year, so each field would go through the cycle of winter crop, spring crop, and fallow over 3 years. This system was more productive than the older 2-field system where half the land lay fallow at any time. With 3-field rotation, only 1/3 of the land is fallow. This means more land is productive at any given time. The introduction of 3-field rotation in medieval Europe contributed to agricultural productivity increases. Guillaume reached his assigned strip in the field. He carried tools with him. Agricultural tools in medieval times were simple. The primary tool for working soil was the plough. A plough is a device that cuts into soil and turns it over, preparing it for planting. Medieval ploughs came in different designs. In Northern Europe, heavy ploughs with wheels and mouldboards were used. These ploughs were effective at turning the heavy wet soils common in that region. They were typically pulled by oxen. Oxen are cattle, specifically castrated male cattle, that have been trained to pull loads. Training oxen requires time and patience. Young cattle must be taught to respond to commands and to pull steadily against resistance. Once trained, oxen are strong and reliable work animals. However, they are slow. They walk at a pace of about 2 to 3 kilometers per hour when pulling a plough. This means ploughing a field takes considerable time. A team of oxen typically consists of 2 animals yoked together. A yoke is a wooden beam that fits across the necks or shoulders of the animals and attaches to the plough. The yoke distributes the load between the 2 animals. Properly fitting and attaching the yoke is important to avoid injuring the animals and to ensure efficient transfer of force to the plough. Guillaume did not own oxen. They were expensive, and most serfs could not afford them. Instead, oxen were owned collectively by the village or by the lord. Peasants would share the use of the oxen, coordinating schedules so each peasant could plough their strips when needed. This required cooperation and organisation within the village community. On this particular day, Guillaume would be working by hand rather than ploughing. Perhaps the ploughing had already been done, and now the field needed other attention. There are many tasks in agriculture besides ploughing. Weeding is one such task. Weeds are plants that grow where they are not wanted. In agricultural fields, any plant that is not the desired crop is considered a weed. Weeds compete with crop plants for water, nutrients, and sunlight. If weeds are not controlled, They can significantly reduce crop yields. Weeding is done by hand. Guillaume would walk through the field, identify weeds, and pull them from the ground. This requires bending over repeatedly and grasping plants and pulling. It is physically demanding work, particularly for the back and legs. It is also tedious work because it must be done carefully to avoid pulling up crop plants along with weeds. The weeds that are pulled must be removed from the field. If left on the ground, some might reroot and continue growing. The pulled weeds might be carried to the edge of the field and piled there to decompose. Decomposing plant material eventually returns nutrients to the soil, but it should not be left among the crops where it could harbour pests or diseases. Guillaume would work for many hours. The length of the workday in medieval agriculture was determined by daylight. Work would begin at sunrise or shortly after, and continue until sunset or shortly before. In summer, when days are long, this could mean fire could ignite a thatched roof, and once burning it would be very difficult to extinguish. Entire villages could be destroyed by fires that started in thatched roofs and spread from building to building. Thatched roofs also deteriorate over time and need to be replaced every 20 to 40 years depending on the materials and climate. Guillaume rose from his bed. Rising from bed involves a series of muscular contractions coordinated by the nervous system. The brain sends signals through the spinal cord to various muscles. These muscles contract in a specific sequence to move the body from a lying position to a sitting position and then to a standing position. This is a complex action that humans learn in infancy and then perform without conscious thought throughout their lives. After rising, Guillaume would need to attend to certain bodily functions. All humans need to urinate and defecate regularly. These are biological necessities resulting from the digestive and urinary systems processing food and water and eliminating waste products. In medieval villages, toilet facilities were primitive by modern standards. A typical medieval peasant would relieve themselves in an outdoor location designated for this purpose. This might be a simple pit in the ground, possibly with a wooden structure built over it for some privacy and to prevent falling in. Such structures were called privies or outhouses. The waste would accumulate in the pit. When the pit became full, it might be covered with dirt and a new pit dug elsewhere, or the waste might be removed and used as fertilizer for crops. Human waste contains nitrogen and other nutrients that plants need. Therefore, despite being unpleasant, human waste has agricultural value. However, it can also contain disease-causing organisms. The relationship between waste disposal and disease was not understood in medieval times. The germ theory of disease would not be developed until the 19th century, hundreds of years in the future from 1095. After attending to biological necessities, Guillaume would need to eat breakfast. Breakfast is the first meal of the day. The word breakfast literally means breaking the fast, because sleeping overnight constitutes a period of fasting, meaning not eating. Breaking this fast with food in the morning is therefore break fast. Medieval peasants typically ate simple foods. Bread was a staple. Bread is made from grain that has been ground into flour, mixed with water to form dough, and then baked. The type of grain used for bread varied by region and by the wealth of the person eating it. Wheat makes the finest bread, but wheat was expensive. Peasants more commonly ate bread made from rye, barley or oats, or from a mixture of grains called maslin. The bread eaten by medieval peasants was different from modern bread. It was denser and coarser because the flour was not ground as fine as modern flour. Medieval mills were powered by water or wind and used millstones to grind grain. Millstones are large, flat, circular stones. Grain is placed between two millstones, and one stone rotates against the other, crushing the grain. However, this process does not produce flour as fine as modern roller mills. Also, medieval bread often contained impurities. Small fragments of stone from the millstones could end up in the flour. These fragments would be baked into the bread and could damage teeth when the bread was chewed. Dental problems were common in medieval times, and eating bread containing stone fragments contributed to tooth wear. Guillaume might eat his bread with some accompaniment. This could be cheese, which is made from milk. Milk comes from domesticated animals, primarily cows, goats, or sheep. These animals are ruminants. Ruminants are mammals that have a specialized digestive system with multiple stomach chambers. They can digest plant material that humans cannot digest. The process of making cheese involves several steps. First, milk is collected passed from generation to generation through speech and example. This oral culture had different characteristics from literate cultures. In oral cultures, memory is particularly important. People develop techniques for remembering large amounts of information. Poetry and song are used as memory aids because rhythm and rhyme make information easier to remember. Stories are structured in formulaic ways that aid recall. Wise elders who can remember traditions and precedents are valued. Guillaume, working in the field, was part of this oral culture. He knew things that his father had taught him, that his father had learned from his father, going back through many generations. He knew when to plant different crops, how to recognize signs of weather changes in the sky and wind, how to care for animals, how to repair tools, and countless other practical matters. This knowledge was well adapted to the local environment. It represented centuries of accumulated experience about how to survive and farm in this specific region with its specific climate and soil and conditions. However, this knowledge was also limited to local conditions and traditional practices. Innovation was slow because there were few mechanisms for sharing new ideas across distances or testing them systematically. As Guillaume worked through the morning, the sun rose higher in the sky. The sun is a star, as mentioned in the previous story about ancient Egypt. The earth orbits the sun. The earth's rotation on its axis creates the cycle of day and night. The tilt of the earth's axis creates the seasons. These are facts of astronomy and physics. However, medieval people did not understand these facts. The prevailing view in medieval Europe was that the earth was the center of the universe, and that the sun, moon, planets, and stars all orbited around the earth. This geocentric model was based on the work of ancient Greek astronomer Ptolemy and was endorsed by the Catholic Church. The Church was the dominant institution in medieval Europe. The Catholic Church had authority over religious matters, which in medieval thinking encompassed most aspects of life. The Church taught that the universe was created by God and was organized hierarchically with Earth at the center, humans as God's special creation, and heaven above. This worldview was comprehensive and gave people a sense of meaning and purpose. Humans were seen as part of a divine plan. Suffering in this life could be endured with the hope of reward in the afterlife. The social order, however unjust it might appear, was seen as ordained by God and therefore legitimate. The church was also a major landowner. Monasteries and bishops owned vast estates worked by peasants similar to Guillaume. The church collected tithes, which were taxes of 1/10 of people's agricultural produce. These tithes supported the clergy and funded church construction and other activities. In 1095, the year we have set this story, something significant was about to happen regarding the church. In November of 1095, Pope Urban II would call for a crusade to retake Jerusalem from Muslim control. This event would launch the Crusades, a series of religious wars that would continue for centuries and have profound effects on European and Middle Eastern history. The First Crusade, launched in response to Urban II's call, would involve tens of thousands of people leaving Europe to travel to the Middle East. Many would die along the way or in battles. The Crusaders would eventually capture Jerusalem in 1099, establishing Crusader states that would persist for varying lengths of time before being reconquered by Muslim forces. But if the morning we are describing these events had not yet occurred, Guillaume was working in his field, unaware of the dramatic historical changes that would begin later that same year. For Guillaume and millions of others, life was a daily struggle for subsistence. Historical events at the level of popes and crusades were remote from immediate concerns. Guillaume's immediate concerns were simple and urgent: growing enough food to feed his family and to meet his obligations to his lord, maintaining his house and tools, staying healthy in the absence of effective medicine, coping with the physical demands and monotony of agricultural labour. The physical demands of medieval peasant life were severe. Agricultural work required strength and endurance. Guillaume would be lifting, carrying, digging, pulling, pushing, bending, and walking throughout long work days. This physical exertion required adequate nutrition, but peasant diets were often marginal. Peasants ate primarily bread and grain porridge, supplemented with vegetables from their gardens when available. Meat was rare in peasant diets. Hunting was often restricted by lords who claimed exclusive rights to game animals in forests. Peasants might have chickens for eggs or a pig that could be slaughtered once a year, but daily meat consumption was not typical. This diet provided calories primarily from carbohydrates. Protein was limited, which could affect muscle development and recovery from physical labour. Vitamins and minerals were also sometimes insufficient. Vitamin deficiencies could lead to diseases like scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, or rickets, caused by lack of vitamin D. Food availability varied by season. Late winter and early spring, before new crops were ready to harvest, were times when food stores might run low. This period was sometimes called the hungry gap. People might lose weight during this time and be weakened, making them more vulnerable to disease. Diseases were common and often fatal in medieval times. Infectious diseases spread easily in conditions of poor sanitation and crowding. Bacterial infections that would be easily treated with antibiotics today could be deadly in medieval times. Even minor injuries could become infected and led to serious complications or death. Life expectancy in medieval Europe was low by modern standards. Estimates vary, but average life expectancy at birth might have been 30 to 35 years. However, this average is heavily influenced by high infant and child mortality. Many children died before age 5 from diseases, accidents, or malnutrition. If a person survived childhood, they had a reasonable chance of living into their 50s or even 60s. However, even adults faced many health risks. Women faced particular risks from childbirth. Maternal mortality was high. Many women died during or shortly after giving birth due to complications, infections, or hemorrhaging. Medical knowledge and treatment in medieval times were limited. Physicians were rare and expensive, serving primarily wealthy individuals. Medical theory was based on the works of ancient Greek physicians like Galen and on the concept of humours. The body was believed to contain 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was thought to result from imbalances in these humours. Treatments aimed to restore balance. This might involve bloodletting, which was removing blood from the patient using lancets or leeches. It might involve purging, which meant causing vomiting or diarrhea to expel excess humours. These treatments were generally ineffective and sometimes harmful, but they were based on the best medical understanding available at the time. Most people, including Guillaume, would never see a physician. Instead, they relied on folk remedies passed down through families and communities. Some of these remedies had genuine medicinal value. Plants like willow bark, which contains a compound similar to aspirin, could relieve pain. Honey has antibacterial properties and could be applied to wounds. Other folk remedies were based on superstition or magical thinking. Amulets might be worn to ward off disease. Prayers and pilgrimages might be undertaken seeking divine healing. The distinction between medicine, magic, and religion was not clear in medieval thinking. All were approaches to dealing with forces beyond human control. Guillaume, working in the field, would be exposed to many health risks. Agricultural work involved injuries from tools. A cut from a sickle or an axe could easily become infected. Back injuries were common from heavy lifting and repetitive bending. Joint problems developed from years of physical labour. Exposure to weather could lead to frostbite in winter or heat stroke in summer. As midday approached, Guillaume would pause for a meal. This meal would be similar to breakfast: bread, perhaps with cheese or onions, water or ale to drink. The meal would be eaten in the field or at the edge of the field. There would be no elaborate preparation or presentation. Food was fuel for continuing work, not an aesthetic or social experience as it might be for wealthy people. After eating, Guillaume would return to work. The afternoon would be similar to the morning: repetitive physical labour under the sun or clouds, weeding or perhaps hoeing, which involves using a hoe to break up soil and remove weeds. A hoe is a tool with a flat blade at the end of a long handle. The user swings the hoe in a chopping motion to cut through soil and plant stems. Hours would pass slowly. Time in medieval agriculture was not measured by clocks, which were rare and expensive. Instead, time was marked by the sun's position in the sky, by church bells that might ring at certain times for prayers, or simply by the body's own rhythms of hunger and fatigue. The concept of time itself was different in medieval life than in modern life. There was no rigid schedule of the type that structures modern work. There were no set start and end times for the workday, no coffee breaks, no weekends in the modern sense. Work was task-oriented rather than time-oriented. You worked until the necessary tasks were complete, or until darkness fell. This gave medieval life a different rhythm than modern life. It was in some ways more flexible, less regimented. But it was also more demanding because work was never truly finished. There was always another task waiting. and there was no clear separation between work time and personal time. Life and work were integrated. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Guillaume would begin to tire. Physical fatigue accumulates through the day. Muscles deplete their energy stores. The nervous system becomes less efficient. Concentration wanes. Movements become slower and less precise. Eventually, as the sun sank toward the horizon, Guillaume would finish his work for the day. He would gather his tools and walk back to the village. The walk would be a time of transition from work to home. The body would begin to relax slightly. The mind might wander to thoughts of the evening meal and rest. Arriving home, Guillaume would need to complete a few more tasks before eating and sleeping. Animals would need to be fed if the family kept any. Water might need to be fetched. Firewood might need to be brought in. These daily maintenance tasks were necessary to keep the household functioning. Eventually, a simple evening meal would be prepared and eaten. Then, as darkness fell and working became impossible, it would be time to sleep. Sleep was necessary for recovering from the day's exertion. Without artificial lighting, there was little point in staying awake after dark anyway. People typically went to bed shortly after sunset and woke at dawn. This daily cycle would repeat day after day, week after week, season after season, year after year. Guillaume's life would be a series of these cycles with little variation, except for the different agricultural tasks in different seasons and occasional disruptions from festivals, illnesses, deaths, births, or other events. Now, the title of this piece is Why You Wouldn't Last a Day in the Age of the Crusades. Having described a typical day for a medieval peasant, we can consider why a modern person would find this life extremely difficult. First, the physical demands would be overwhelming for most modern people. Agricultural labour required strength and endurance that most modern people do not possess. Modern life is largely sedentary. Many people work at desks or in other positions that require little physical exertion. Even people who exercise regularly typically do not exercise for 12 hours straight while bending, lifting, and carrying. A modern person suddenly placed into Guillaume's life would likely experience extreme muscle soreness within hours. By the end of the first day, they would be exhausted. Their hands would blister from using tools. Their back would ache from bending. They might be sunburned from exposure. They would be hungry because the food, while providing calories, would be bland and possibly insufficient in quantity. Second, the lack of modern conveniences would be shocking. No running water means water must be carried from a well or stream. This is heavy work. A full bucket of water weighs about 10 kilograms or more. Multiple trips would be needed daily to supply water for drinking, cooking, and basic washing. No indoor plumbing means using an outdoor privy in all weather. In winter, this means trudging through snow or mud in cold weather to use a smelly, uncomfortable facility. The lack of toilet paper means using other methods to clean oneself, such as cloth that must then be washed, or perhaps leaves or other plant material. No electricity means no artificial light except candles or oil lamps, which are dim and expensive. It means no refrigeration, so food spoils quickly. It means no heating except fires, which are smoky and require constant fuel. No electric stoves mean cooking over open fires, which requires skill to control temperature. Third, the diet would be extremely monotonous and nutritionally inadequate by modern standards. Bread, and more bread, with occasional cheese or vegetables. No coffee or tea, no chocolate, no tropical fruits, no sugar, except occasional honey. No spices except perhaps salt and herbs that grow locally. The same foods day after day, year after year. Modern people are accustomed to variety and flavour in their diets. The blandness of medieval peasant food would be depressing. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables for much of the year would lead to vitamin deficiencies that would cause fatigue, weakness and illness. Fourth, the medical situation would be terrifying for a modern person. No antibiotics means infections could easily become fatal. No anesthesia means any surgery would be agonizingly painful. No understanding of hygiene means even simple wounds could lead to deadly infections. The knowledge that a minor injury could kill you would create constant anxiety. Fifth, the lack of personal freedom would be oppressive. As a serf, you would be bound to the land. You could not leave without permission. You could not choose your occupation. Your time and labour would be partially owned by your lord. You would have no political rights. You would have no privacy. Everyone in the village would know your business. Sixth, the general filth and lack of sanitation would be revolting. People bathed infrequently, perhaps a few times per year. Clothes were rarely washed because washing by hand is very laborious and soap was expensive. People smelled of sweat, smoke, and worse. Houses harboured fleas, lice, and rodents. Streets and floors were covered with mud, animal waste, and garbage. Seventh, the violence and insecurity would be frightening. Medieval society was violent. Disputes were often settled through physical force. Lords could punish peasants arbitrarily. Bandits might attack travellers. Wars might sweep through regions with soldiers pillaging and burning. There was no police force to provide protection or enforce laws consistently. Eighth, the social isolation would be profound for someone accustomed to modern communication. No internet, obviously, no phones, no postal service. For ordinary people, news travelled slowly by word of mouth. You would know only what happened in your village and what travellers might report from elsewhere. Your world would be extremely small geographically and socially. Ninth, the weather would be a constant threat. No weather forecasts, no climate control. When it was hot, you suffered heat. When it was cold, you suffered cold. Rain meant mud and wet clothes that might take days to dry. Snow meant isolation and difficulty obtaining fuel and food. Your comfort and survival depended on factors completely beyond your control. Tenth, the sheer boredom and monotony would be psychologically crushing. The same tasks day after day. No books to read. No music except what could be made locally. No entertainment except rare festivals. No travel except perhaps a pilgrimage once in a lifetime. No possibility of changing your circumstances. You would know that your life would be the same until you died, and your children's lives would be the same. For all these reasons and many more, a modern person would indeed not last a day in the age of the Crusades. The physical hardship, the primitive conditions, the dangers, the lack of freedom, the monotony, all would combine to make life nearly unbearable for someone accustomed to modern comfort, safety, and convenience. Yet millions of people lived this way, not just the medieval period, but throughout most of human history. This was normal life for most humans for most of history. The comfort and convenience of modern life is a very recent development, limited to a small portion of humanity and to the last century or two. Understanding medieval life helps us appreciate how different life once was and how much has changed. It helps us understand that what seems natural and necessary to us, individual freedom, comfort, variety, entertainment, mobility, was not available to our ancestors and is still not available to everyone today. It also raises questions about whether modern life, for all its advantages, has costs that we may not fully appreciate. Medieval people, despite their hardships, lived in stable communities with strong social bonds. They had a sense of purpose provided by religion. They worked with their hands and saw tangible results of their labour. They lived in rhythm with natural cycles. Modern people have material abundance and personal freedom, but often lack community, purpose, and connection to nature. They experience stress, anxiety, and depression, despite living in conditions that would seem like paradise to a medieval peasant. This suggests that human happiness depends on factors beyond just material comfort, and that progress is more complex than simply improving material conditions. But these are philosophical reflections. Returning to the concrete reality of medieval life, we can explore more specific aspects of why it would be so difficult for a modern person. Consider clothing. Medieval peasants owned very few clothes. They might have one set of clothes for daily wear and perhaps one slightly better outfit for church on Sundays. These clothes were made of wool or linen. Wool came from sheep. The wool would be washed, combed, spun into thread and woven into cloth, all by hand. This was enormously time-consuming. Spinning thread involved using a drop spindle, which is a stick with a weight on the end. Fibres would be attached to the spindle and twisted into thread as the spindle was spun and dropped. This produced a continuous thread that could be wound onto the spindle. Spinning enough thread for one garment could take many hours. Weaving involved using a loom to interlace threads to create cloth. Looms in medieval peasant households were simple devices. The weaver would pass a shuttle carrying thread back and forth between vertical threads stretched on the loom frame. This was also time-consuming and required skill to produce even, strong cloth. Once cloth was produced, it had to be cut and sewn into garments. Sewing was done by hand, using bone or metal needles and thread. Careful sewing was necessary to make garments that would hold together under the stress of daily wear and washing. Given the amount of work required to produce cloth and clothing, it is understandable that people owned few clothes and wore them until they were completely worn out. Clothes might be patched and repaired many times. When clothes became too worn to repair, the fabric might be repurposed for other uses such as rags or quilts. A modern person used to owning multiple outfits and changing clothes daily would find the medieval clothing situation unpleasant. Wearing the same sweaty, dirty clothes day after day would be uncomfortable. The rough texture of medieval cloth would be irritating to skin accustomed to soft modern fabrics. The inability to adjust clothing for different weather and activities would be frustrating. Consider also hygiene and grooming. As mentioned, bathing was infrequent. When people did bathe, it would be in a wooden tub filled with water heated over a fire. This was a laborious process, so it was not done often. People might wash hands and faces more frequently, but full-body bathing was rare. Hair care was minimal. Hair might be combed with wooden or bone combs to remove lice and tangles, but there was no shampoo or conditioner. Men might have beards because shaving required sharp blades and was difficult and potentially dangerous. Women kept their hair covered with cloths or veils. Dental care was almost non-existent. There were no toothbrushes or toothpaste. People might clean their teeth by rubbing them with cloth or chewing on sticks, but this was not very effective. Tooth decay was common. Painful toothaches would be endured because there was little that could be done. Eventually, severely decayed teeth might be pulled by barbers or blacksmiths using pliers without any anesthesia. The pain of dental problems alone would be almost unbearable for a modern person accustomed to dental care and pain relief. Combined with the constant discomfort of dirty skin, dirty hair, dirty clothes, and unwashed surroundings, the general level of physical discomfort would be relentless. Consider also the sleeping arrangements. As described, Guillaume slept on a straw mattress. This was shared with his wife and possibly with children as well. Privacy was not a concept. The entire family would sleep in the same room, possibly in the same bed. In winter, this had the advantage of shared warmth, but it meant no personal space. The straw mattress would harbour fleas and other insects. These would bite during the night, causing itching and interrupted sleep. The room would be cold in winter because there was no heating except possibly a fire that might be banked overnight, but would not provide much warmth. The room would be dark because there was no light except perhaps a dim oil lamp or candle. Sleep would be frequently disturbed. Babies would cry. Children would wake. Noises from animals in the house or outside would be audible. The need to urinate during the night would require getting up and going outside in the cold and dark to the privy, or using a chamber pot that would smell and need to be emptied in the morning. A modern person accustomed to a comfortable mattress, clean sheets, a private room, climate control, and quiet would find medieval sleeping conditions nearly impossible. The combination of physical discomfort, lack of privacy, cold, and disturbances would result in poor sleep, leading to fatigue and irritability. Consider the working conditions more carefully. Agricultural work was not just physically demanding but also dangerous. Tools like scythes, sickles, axes, and knives were sharp and could cause serious injuries. There was no safety training or protective equipment. Accidents were common. A slip while using a scythe could result in a deep cut to the leg. Such a wound would bleed heavily. There would be no way to call for emergency help. Someone would need to apply pressure to stop the bleeding. The wound might be bandaged with cloth, but there would be no antiseptic to prevent infection. If infection developed, there would be no antibiotics. The person might develop fever and die within days. Similarly, agricultural work involved heavy lifting. A person might strain their back or develop a hernia. There would be no medical treatment. They would simply have to live with chronic pain and reduced capacity for work. This would make their already difficult life even harder. Animals also posed dangers. Oxen or horses used for ploughing could kick or step on people. Pigs could bite. Even chickens could peck aggressively. Without veterinary care, sick or injured animals might behave unpredictably. A person gored by an ox's horn or kicked by a horse could be seriously injured or killed. The weather was also a significant danger. Working in fields during thunderstorms exposed people to lightning strikes. Working in extreme heat could cause heat stroke. Working in extreme cold could cause frostbite. There was no option to simply stop working because of weather unless conditions were absolutely impossible. Work had to be done regardless of discomfort or danger. Now, let us consider what would happen if the Crusades actually came to Guillaume's village. The First Crusade began in 1096, shortly after Pope Urban II's call in November 1095. Tens of thousands of people participated. Many were knights and nobles, but many others were common people inspired by religious fervour, or seeking adventure or hoping to escape their current circumstances. Crusade recruitment would happen through preaching. Wandering preachers would travel through regions, delivering sermons about the holy cause of retaking Jerusalem from the Muslims. These sermons would describe the supposed atrocities committed by Muslims against Christian pilgrims. They would promise spiritual rewards for those who took up the cross. They would paint the crusade as a holy adventure. Some people would be genuinely moved by religious conviction. The medieval worldview was deeply religious. People believed in heaven and hell as literal places. They believed their soul's eternal fate depended on their actions and faith. The promise that joining a crusade would guarantee salvation was powerful. Others would be motivated by more worldly concerns. Younger sons of nobles, who would not inherit land under the system of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits everything, might see the crusade as an opportunity to gain wealth and estates in the Holy Land. Merchants might see opportunities for trade. Criminals might see a chance to escape punishment, since crusaders were often granted legal immunity. For a peasant like Guillaume, joining a crusade would be complicated. He could not simply leave because he was bound to the land. He would need permission from his lord. Some lords might grant permission, either out of religious enthusiasm or because they wanted their peasants to go and perhaps bring back wealth that could be taxed. If Guillaume did join a crusade, he would face enormous challenges. First, he would need to travel from France to the Middle East. This was a journey of thousands of kilometers through unfamiliar and often hostile territories. Crusaders travelled in large groups for safety, but these groups were often poorly organized and supplied. The journey would take many months, possibly over a year. Crusaders would walk the entire way, since horses were expensive and were needed for knights. They would need to find food along the route by purchasing it from locals or by foraging, or sometimes by pillaging. Many crusaders starved or died from disease during the journey before ever reaching the Holy Land. The route passed through different kingdoms and empires, some friendly, some neutral, some hostile. The Byzantine Empire, which was Christian but had a complicated relationship with Western Europe, sometimes helped crusaders and sometimes hindered them. Muslim territories would obviously resist the passage of crusading armies. Crusaders would face battles along the way. Medieval warfare was brutal. Battles involved hand-to-hand combat with swords, spears, axes, and other weapons. Men would hack and slash at each other. Bodies would be mutilated. Blood would be everywhere. The screaming of wounded and dying men and horses would be horrific. Guillaume, if he survived battles, would witness atrocities. Medieval warfare included massacres of civilian populations. Cities that resisted crusaders were sometimes sacked, with inhabitants killed regardless of age or sex. Crusaders committed acts of terrible violence, justified in their minds by religious ideology, but horrifying by any moral standard. Even if Guillaume avoided death in battle, he would face constant danger from disease. Armies on campaign lived in unsanitary conditions. They camped in fields without toilets or clean water. Diseases spread rapidly. Dysentery, typhus, and other infectious diseases killed more crusaders than combat did. If Guillaume somehow survived the journey and the battles and reached Jerusalem, he might participate in the siege and capture of the city in 1099. The Crusaders broke through the walls and massacred the population. Contemporary accounts describe streets running with blood. Thousands of Muslims and Jews were killed. It was a bloodbath. A modern person transported to this scene would be traumatized beyond words. The violence, the cruelty, the suffering would be overwhelming. Even soldiers trained for combat in modern times would find medieval warfare shocking because of its intimate brutality. For an ordinary civilian, it would be utterly incomprehensible and unbearable. After the capture of Jerusalem, some crusaders returned to Europe. The journey home would be as difficult as the journey there. Many died on the return trip. Guillaume, if he survived everything and returned home, would be changed by his experiences. He would have seen and done things that would haunt him. He might suffer from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. But most likely, Guillaume would not join a crusade. Most peasants stayed home. For them, the Crusades were distant events that might be heard about from travellers or mentioned in sermons but did not directly affect their lives. Their daily struggle for survival continued regardless of what popes and kings were doing. However, the Crusades did have indirect effects on European society. They increased contact between Europe and the Middle East, facilitating trade and cultural exchange. They stimulated economic activity as crusaders needed supplies and equipment. They affected power dynamics between nobles, kings, and the church. For our purposes, considering why a modern person would not last a day in the age of the Crusades, we can see that the era was characterized by violence, hardship, disease, and suffering on a scale that is difficult for modern people to imagine. Even without directly participating in crusades, life was brutally hard. Let us return to Guillaume's ordinary life and consider more aspects of it. Social relationships in medieval villages were complex. Everyone knew everyone else. There was no anonymity. Reputation mattered enormously because you could not simply move to a new place and start over. You were stuck with the same neighbours for life. This meant that social harmony was important. Disputes had to be managed carefully because you could not avoid the people you disagreed with. Gossip was a powerful social force. Community pressure enforced norms of behaviour. People who violated norms could be ostracized or punished through informal mechanisms like mockery or exclusion. However, this also meant there was a support network. When someone was sick or injured, neighbours would help. When a house burned down, the community would help rebuild. When someone died, the community would share in mourning and support the surviving family. This solidarity was necessary for survival in a world with no government social services. The church played a central role in village life. The church building was often the only stone structure in the village. It was where the community gathered on Sundays for Mass. It was where baptisms, weddings, and funerals took place. It was where people sought spiritual guidance and comfort. The priest was one of the few literate people in the village. He could read the Bible and other religious texts. He delivered sermons explaining Christian doctrine. He administered sacraments. He also might record births, marriages, and deaths, though formal record-keeping was limited in this period. The church calendar structured the year. There were many feast days celebrating different saints. These were occasions for rest from work and for celebration. There were also periods of fasting, particularly Lent before Easter, when people were supposed to abstain from meat and other foods. Religious belief was deep and sincere for most people. The supernatural was very real in medieval consciousness. People believed in God, angels, saints, the devil, and demons. They believed that supernatural forces affected their lives constantly. They prayed for protection and assistance. They sought intercession from saints. They feared divine punishment. This religious worldview provided comfort and meaning in a harsh world. It explained suffering as part of God's plan or as punishment for sin. It promised justice in the afterlife, even if there was no justice in this life. It gave people hope that their struggles had purpose. A modern secular person would find this religious saturation strange and possibly oppressive. The constant prayers, the religious festivals, the church's authority over many aspects of life, the belief in supernatural intervention, all would feel alien. The inability to express skepticism or disbelief without risking social condemnation or worse would be constraining. Consider also the treatment of women in medieval society. Women had fewer rights than men. They could not own property independently in many cases. They could not hold political office. Their legal identity was subsumed under their fathers or husbands. They were expected to be obedient and submissive. Women's work was essential, but was often invisible and undervalued. As mentioned, women did household work, childcare, cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, and also helped with agricultural work. This was a tremendous amount of labour, but it was seen as simply women's natural duty rather than as work deserving recognition or compensation. Women also faced specific dangers. Childbirth was extremely dangerous. A woman might have 6, 8, 10 or more pregnancies in her lifetime. Each pregnancy and birth carried a risk of death. Many women died in childbirth or from complications afterward. This was simply accepted as part of women's lot in life. Sexual violence against women was common and often went unpunished, especially if the perpetrator was of higher social status than the victim. Women had little recourse. The legal system was controlled by men. Social norms blamed women for tempting men rather than holding men accountable for their actions. A modern woman transported to medieval times would face all the hardships that men faced, plus additional hardships specific to being a woman. She would have no legal rights. She would be considered property of her male relatives. She would be expected to marry whoever her family chose. She would face danger in childbirth. She would likely experience sexual harassment or assault with no possibility of justice. Even if the medieval woman internalized the social norms and accepted her position, which most did because they knew no alternative, the physical hardships would be overwhelming. The constant work, the lack of medical care, the frequent pregnancies, the high risk of death, all would combine to make life extremely difficult. Children in medieval society also faced hardships. Many died in infancy or early childhood from disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Those who survived had to work from a young age. There was no concept of childhood as a protected period of play and education. Children were simply small adults who were expected to contribute to household labour as soon as they were able. Discipline was harsh. Physical punishment was considered normal and necessary. Children who misbehaved would be hit. The saying, "spare the rod and spoil the child," reflected the belief that physical punishment was essential for proper moral development. Education was minimal, as discussed. Most children learned only what was necessary for their station in life. They learned by doing, by watching and imitating adults. Abstract knowledge or critical thinking skills were not cultivated. Children were taught to obey authority, follow tradition, and accept their place in the social hierarchy. A modern child transported to medieval times would be confused and frightened. The expectations would be incomprehensible. The discipline would be traumatic. The lack of play, entertainment, and education would be depressing. The constant work would be exhausting. The separation from modern comforts and conveniences would be disorienting. Let us consider also the legal system in medieval times. Law was very different from modern law. There was no presumption of innocence. There were no professional lawyers or judges in many cases. Trials might involve ordeals, where the accused would be subjected to painful or dangerous tests on the theory that God would protect the innocent. For example, trial by ordeal might involve the accused carrying a red-hot iron bar for a certain distance. The hand would be bandaged, and after a few days the bandage would be removed. If the hand had healed cleanly, the person was judged innocent. If it was infected, they were judged guilty. Obviously, this was not a reliable method of determining guilt or innocence, but it was believed that divine intervention would ensure just results. Another form of trial was combat. Disputes might be settled by the parties fighting, or by hiring champions to fight on their behalf. The winner of the fight was judged to be in the right. Again, this was based on the belief that God would grant victory to the just party. Punishments were harsh and often physical. Common punishments included mutilation, cutting off hands, ears, or noses, branding, whipping, and execution. Executions were public spectacles. People would gather to watch criminals being hanged, beheaded, or burned alive. The justice system was not impartial. The wealthy and powerful could often escape punishment. The poor had little recourse against injustice. Lords had the right to judge their serfs and could impose arbitrary punishments. There was no appeal to a higher authority in many cases. A modern person accustomed to due process, legal representation, reasonable punishments, and some semblance of impartiality would find the medieval legal system terrifying. The possibility of being accused of a crime, subjected to an ordeal or combat, and punished brutally without what we would consider a fair trial would create constant anxiety. Consider also the limited scope of life in medieval times. Most people never travelled more than a few kilometres from where they were born. They knew only their village and perhaps a few neighbouring villages. The idea of travelling for pleasure or to see distant places was inconceivable for peasants. This geographical limitation meant an extremely narrow worldview. People knew about distant places only from stories and rumours, which were often wildly inaccurate. The world beyond one's immediate area was mysterious and frightening. Strange lands were populated with monsters and demons in popular imagination. A modern person accustomed to global communication, international travel, and awareness of diverse cultures and places would find this provincial existence claustrophobic. The inability to simply leave and go somewhere else, to experience new places and meet new people, would feel like imprisonment. The absence of intellectual stimulation would also be difficult. No books to read, no news to follow, no ideas to debate. Conversation would be limited to gossip about local matters and perhaps religious teachings. There would be no exposure to different perspectives or new knowledge. For someone accustomed to constant information and entertainment from the internet, television, books, and other sources, the intellectual barrenness of medieval life would be maddening. The same conversations about the same topics with the same people, day after day, year after year, would be numbingly boring. Yet people endured this. They had no comparison, so they did not know what they were missing. Their expectations were shaped by their reality. They found meaning and satisfaction within the constraints of their world. They celebrated small pleasures, a good harvest, a festival, a new baby, a sunny day. This reminds us that happiness is relative. It depends not just on objective conditions, but on expectations and comparisons. Medieval peasants might have been happier than some modern people, despite their objectively worse living conditions, because they did not expect or even imagine anything better. Conversely, modern people with all their advantages might be unhappy because they compare themselves to others who have even more, or because they have been led to expect constant novelty and stimulation that reality cannot provide. These reflections bring us back to the central question: why wouldn't you last a day in the age of the Crusades? The physical hardships alone would be overwhelming. The lack of modern conveniences would be shocking. The dangers would be frightening. The social constraints would be oppressive. The boredom would be crushing. The violence and injustice would be traumatic. But perhaps the deepest reason is psychological. A modern person has a fundamentally different sense of self and of possibility than a medieval person. We believe in individual autonomy, in the possibility of self-improvement and social mobility, in human rights and dignity, in progress and change. Medieval people believed in divine order, social hierarchy, duty and obligation, tradition and stability. A modern person thrust into medieval society would not just suffer physically, they would suffer existentially. Their entire sense of how life should be, of what it means to be human, would be violated. They would experience not just discomfort, but a profound alienation from the world they found themselves in. And yet, understanding medieval life can enrich our understanding of humanity. It shows us that humans can endure astonishing hardships. It shows us that meaning and happiness can be found in circumstances we would consider unbearable. It shows us that our own values and assumptions are not universal or natural, but are products of specific historical circumstances. So while you would not last a day in the age of the Crusades, contemplating what that life was like can deepen your appreciation for the present and your understanding of the human condition across time and cultures. The story of Guillaume, our fictional medieval peasant, has now been told at excruciating length. Every tedious detail of his ordinary day has been examined. The historical context has been explained at numbing length. The reasons why modern people could not survive in his world have been thoroughly enumerated. But we have not yet finished exploring all aspects of medieval life that would make it impossible for a modern person to survive. Let us continue with even more tedious details about the daily existence in the age of the Crusades. Consider the matter of time measurement more closely. As mentioned briefly earlier, mechanical clocks did not exist in most places during the medieval period, the water or food. Symptoms include sustained fever, weakness, stomach pains, headache, and loss of appetite. Without treatment, about 15 to 30% of cases are fatal. Medieval people had no treatment and did not understand the cause. Dysentery causes severe diarrhea with blood and mucus. It is caused by bacteria, viruses, or parasites spread through contaminated water or food. It causes dehydration that can be fatal, especially in children and elderly. Again, medieval people had no effective treatment. Cholera causes severe watery diarrhea that can lead to dehydration and death within hours if untreated. It is spread through water contaminated with feces from infected persons. Major cholera epidemics occurred throughout history, killing millions. These diseases were common in medieval times. They were accepted as normal hazards of life. People would pray for recovery and might try various ineffective remedies, but mostly they would either recover on their own or die. A modern person suddenly exposed to medieval sanitation would likely become sick very quickly. The contaminated water, the exposure to feces and other waste, the lack of hand washing and hygiene, all would introduce pathogens that modern immune systems might not be prepared for. Even if the modern person knew about germ theory and tried to be careful, it would be very difficult to avoid contamination in an environment where everyone and everything was contaminated. Touching anything, eating any food, drinking any water would be risky. Let us now consider medieval medical practices in even more detail. Medicine in medieval times was based on ancient Greek and Roman medical texts, particularly the works of Hippocrates and Galen. These texts described the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to humoral theory, health depended on these four humours being in balance. Disease occurred when the humours became imbalanced. Treatment aimed to restore balance through various means. Bloodletting was one of the most common treatments. It involved deliberately removing blood from the patient. This could be done by cutting a vein with a lancet, by applying leeches that would suck blood, or by cupping, which involved creating a vacuum in a cup placed on the skin to draw blood to the surface. The theory was that bloodletting would remove excess blood, which was thought to be a hot, wet humour. This was believed to help conditions thought to be caused by too much blood, which included many different ailments. In reality, bloodletting weakened patients and often made them worse or killed them. Purging was another common treatment. This involved inducing vomiting or diarrhea to expel excess humours. Various substances could be used to induce purging. These treatments were unpleasant and debilitating and often harmful. Dieting was also used as treatment. Certain foods were classified as having different humoral qualities. Hot diseases might be treated with cold foods. Dry diseases might be treated with moist foods. These classifications were not based on actual properties of the foods, but on theoretical associations. Herbal remedies were widely used. Some herbs did have genuine medicinal properties. Willow bark contains salicin, which is similar to aspirin and can reduce pain and fever. Foxglove contains digitalis, which affects heart function. Opium poppies contain morphine, which is a powerful painkiller. However, medieval herbalists did not understand the chemical basis of how these herbs worked. They used them based on tradition and observation of effects. Dosing was imprecise. Side effects and toxicity were not well understood. Many other herbal remedies were completely ineffective. They were used because of magical or symbolic associations rather than actual medicinal properties. For example, a plant that looked like a body part might be used to treat ailments of that body part based on the doctrine of signatures, which held that they would know the same few dozen or few hundred people their entire lives. They would see the same landscapes, the same buildings, the same fields. News from distant places travelled slowly and might take weeks or months to arrive. It would come through travellers or through official announcements. Most news was of little relevance to daily life. Whether a king won or lost a battle hundreds of kilometres away made little practical difference to a peasant ploughing a field. The daily routine was unchanging. Wake up, eat, work, eat, sleep. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. The only variations were the different agricultural tasks in different seasons and occasional disruptions for festivals or misfortunes. Social life was limited. You would know all your neighbours intimately because you saw them every day and had known them your entire life. But you would have no opportunity to meet new people, to encounter different ideas, to experience variety. Entertainment was rare and simple. There were no books to read for those who could read. There were no plays or performances except perhaps wandering entertainers at fairs. There was no music except what could be made locally by people singing or playing simple instruments. Conversation would be limited to local gossip, farming talk, and religious discussion. There would be no discussion of science, philosophy, politics beyond the local level, literature or art. The intellectual stimulation that modern people take for granted would be completely absent. The predictability and monotony would be psychologically crushing for a modern person accustomed to constant novelty and stimulation. The inability to travel, to learn new things, to encounter different people and ideas, to have any variety in daily life, all would make existence feel narrow and suffocating. Yet medieval people accepted this as normal. They did not expect variety or novelty. Their satisfactions came from within the narrow confines of their world, completing the day's work, sharing a meal with family, participating in religious festivals, seeing children grow. This reminds us again that happiness is subjective and relative. Modern people with their vast choices and opportunities are not necessarily happier than medieval people with their narrow, predictable lives. Different lives provide different types of satisfactions and different types of challenges. Having now thoroughly exhausted additional topics about medieval life, including sanitation, medicine, violence and monotony, we have painted an even more complete picture of why you truly would not last a day in the age of the Crusades. Sleep well, reader, if you are still awake. Good night. But let us examine one final aspect of medieval life in tedious detail: the role of the church and religion in every aspect of existence during the age of the Crusades. The Catholic Church was the single most powerful institution in medieval Europe. It had authority over not just religious matters, but also many aspects of daily life, politics, law, and culture. The Church taught that it was the sole path to salvation, and that outside the Church there was no salvation. Every person was expected to be a member of the Church through baptism as an infant. Baptism was considered essential for salvation. An unbaptized child who died would not go to heaven, according to Church teaching. This created anxiety for parents, and ensured that infants were baptized as soon as possible after birth. Throughout life, a person would participate in various sacraments. These were rituals believed to convey God's grace. The 7 sacraments were baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, penance, anointing of the sick, holy orders, and matrimony. The Eucharist, also called Mass or Communion, was the central ritual. It involved the priest consecrating bread and wine, which Catholic doctrine held literally became the body and blood of Christ through transubstantiation, attending surround the position and cut off supplies, hoping to starve the defenders into submission. Or they would use siege engines to break through walls. Siege engines included catapults and trebuchets, which hurled large rocks or other projectiles at walls. Battering rams were used to break through gates. Siege towers allowed attackers to reach the top of walls. All of these were dangerous for both attackers and defenders. Defenders would pour boiling oil or water on attackers trying to scale walls. They would shoot arrows and throw rocks. They would use long poles to push ladders away from walls. The fighting would be desperate and vicious. If attackers broke through defences, they would often massacre the defenders and sack the city or castle. This meant killing many people, looting valuable items, burning buildings, and committing acts of sexual violence against women. This was considered normal conduct in medieval warfare. The Crusades exemplified this brutality on a massive scale. Tens of thousands of people died in battles. Civilians were massacred when cities were captured. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099, as mentioned earlier, involved killing thousands of Muslims and Jews in a blood-soaked rampage. A modern person transported to a medieval battlefield would be traumatized by the violence. The sight of mutilated bodies, the screams of wounded and dying men, the smell of blood and bowels, all would be overwhelming. Even trained modern soldiers would find the personal, brutal nature of medieval combat shocking. Violence was not limited to warfare. Crime was common, and law enforcement was weak. Bandits operated in forests and on roads, robbing travellers. Towns might be terrorized by gangs. Powerful nobles might use force to settle disputes, or to simply take what they wanted from weaker parties. Personal violence was also common. Disputes might be settled through physical fights. Men routinely carried weapons and were ready to use them. Honor culture meant that insults might lead to violence. Drunken brawls were frequent. Domestic violence was common and socially acceptable. Men were considered to have the right to physically discipline their wives and children. Beatings were routine. There was no recourse for victims. Women and children were considered property of the male head of household. Violence against marginalized groups was also common. Jews faced persecution and violence throughout medieval Europe. Pogroms, organized attacks on Jewish communities, occurred periodically. During the Crusades, Crusaders sometimes attacked Jewish communities in Europe before even leaving for the Holy Land. Heretics, people accused of holding beliefs contrary to Catholic doctrine, could be tortured and executed. The Inquisition was established in the 13th century to root out heresy. Accused heretics would be interrogated, often under torture, and could be burned at death if found guilty. A modern person from a relatively peaceful society would be shocked by the prevalence of violence. The constant danger, the acceptance of violence as normal, the lack of protection or justice for victims, all would create an atmosphere of fear and insecurity. Let us now examine the crushing monotony and limited horizons of medieval life in more detail that will surely induce sleep. Most people lived their entire lives within a very small geographical area. They would be born in a village, grow up in that village, marry someone from that village or a nearby village, work in fields near that village, and die in that village. Travel was difficult, dangerous, and expensive. Roads were poor, often just dirt paths that became muddy in rain. There were bandits. There were wild animals. There were no maps for common people who could not read anyway. Most people had no reason to travel and no means to do so. This meant that most people's entire world consisted of their village and perhaps a few neighbouring villages they might visit for markets or fairs, might wear simple leather shoes or go barefoot. On the head, men might wear a hood or cap. Women wore a long tunic or dress reaching to the ankles. Over this might be worn an apron. A cloak provided warmth. Women covered their hair as a sign of modesty. Various head coverings were used, including veils and caps. Clothing was expensive because of the labour required to produce it. Therefore, people owned very few clothes and wore them until they were completely worn out. Clothes would be patched and repaired repeatedly. Washing clothes was difficult and required carrying water, heating it, and scrubbing by hand. Soap was expensive. Because washing was so laborious, clothes were washed infrequently. This meant clothes were dirty and smelly. Let us consider medieval housing in more detail. Peasant houses were small and simply built. A typical house might be about 5 meters by 8 meters. The floor was usually packed earth. Walls were wattle and daub. The roof was thatched. Windows were small and few. Glass was expensive and rare. The house would have a central hearth for cooking and heating. Smoke would escape through a hole in the roof. This meant the interior was very smoky. Furniture was minimal. There might be a table, benches, and a bed frame. Storage was limited. The house would also need to accommodate animals in winter. This meant sharing living space with animals. A modern person would find medieval peasant houses claustrophobic, dark, smoky, smelly, and unbearably uncomfortable. The idea of living in such conditions year after year would seem impossible. Having exhausted even more topics about medieval life in this deliberately repetitive and sleep-inducing manner, we can conclude that the age of the Crusades truly was a time when you would not last even a single day. Every aspect of life was so different from modern life, and so much harsher, that survival would be nearly impossible for someone unprepared. If you have read this far, you are surely ready for sleep. The endless details have been presented in the most boring way possible. Rest now. Grateful that you live in modern times. Good night. But there is still more to explore about why you would not last a day in the medieval period. Let us examine the topic of medieval sanitation and waste disposal in exhaustive detail that will surely induce drowsiness. Sanitation in medieval times was primitive by modern standards. There was no understanding of germs or disease transmission. People did not know that waste could spread disease. Therefore, waste disposal was haphazard and inadequate. As mentioned earlier, human waste was deposited in outdoor privies or simply in designated areas away from houses. In cities, which we have not yet discussed in detail, waste disposal was even more problematic. Chamber pots would be used at night, then emptied out windows into the street in the morning. Streets in medieval cities were narrow and often muddy. They would be fouled with human waste. animal waste from horses and other animals, food scraps and other garbage. The smell would be overwhelming. Disease would spread easily in such conditions. Even in villages, sanitation was poor. Animal waste from livestock would be everywhere. Pigs might roam freely, eating garbage. Chickens would leave droppings in yards and even in houses. The general level of filth was extraordinary by modern standards. Water sources could easily become contaminated. Wells could be too close to privies, allowing seepage of waste into the water supply. Streams could be fouled upstream by waste disposal. People would nonetheless use this water for drinking, cooking and washing, spreading disease. Diseases spread by poor sanitation included dysentery, typhoid fever and cholera. These diseases caused severe diarrhea, dehydration and often death. Outbreaks could kill significant portions of a population. There was no effective treatment. Typhoid fever is caused by bacteria. It is spread through contaminated. Mass on Sundays and holy days was obligatory. Penance involved confessing sins to a priest and receiving absolution. People were required to confess at least once a year. The priest would assign penances, prayers or other acts to perform as punishment and purification for sins. This gave priests enormous power over people's private lives and consciences. Marriage was a sacrament that had to be performed by a priest. The church had detailed rules about who could marry whom. Marriages between close relatives were prohibited. Marriage was for life. Divorce was not permitted, though annulments could sometimes be obtained for substantial fees. Holy orders was the sacrament by which men became priests. Priests took vows of celibacy, poverty, and obedience. They were set apart from lay people and had special authority. Only priests could perform sacraments. This made them essential intermediaries between God and ordinary people. The church calendar structured the year. There were numerous feast days celebrating saints and events in Christian history. These were days of rest from work and were occasions for community celebration. There were also fast days when people were supposed to abstain from meat and other foods. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was a period of fasting and penance. People were supposed to eat only one meal per day and to abstain from meat, dairy, and eggs. This was a time of hardship, especially for poor people who could barely afford adequate food normally. The church collected tithes, 10% of people's income or produce. This was mandatory. Refusal to pay tithes could result in excommunication. Tithes supported the clergy, maintained church buildings, and funded other church activities. For poor people, tithes were a significant burden. The church also owned vast amounts of land. In some regions, the church owned as much as 1/3 of all land. This land was worked by peasants who owed feudal obligations to the church just as they would to a secular lord. Monasteries and bishops were major landowners and wielded significant economic and political power. Religious belief shaped every aspect of medieval life. People believed that God controlled everything and that their eternal fate depended on following church teachings. They believed in literal heaven and hell, and in purgatory, a state between the two where souls were purified before entering heaven. They believed in miracles, in saints who could intercede with God, in relics, physical objects associated with saints that supposedly had holy power. People would travel long distances on pilgrimages to visit relics and holy sites, hoping for miracles or spiritual benefits. They believed in the devil and demons as real beings who tempted people to sin and who could possess people. They believed in witchcraft and magic. Any unusual event might be interpreted as supernatural in origin, either divine or demonic. This all-encompassing religious worldview would be very strange for a modern secular person. The inability to question religious authority, the constant religious observances, the fear of hell, the belief in supernatural intervention, all would feel alien and oppressive. And so we finally reach the true conclusion of this extremely long and deliberately boring account of why you would not last a day in the age of the Crusades. Every aspect of medieval life, work, food, shelter, health, safety, religion, freedom, was so radically different from modern life, and so much harsher that survival would be virtually impossible for an unprepared modern person. If you are still reading these words, you have remarkable endurance, or more likely are very drowsy. Sleep well, content in the knowledge that you live in modern times with all their comforts and conveniences, and that you will never have to experience the hardships that Guillaume and millions like him endured daily. The age of the Crusades was truly a time when you would not have lasted even a single day. Rest now, good night. In a poor year it might yield only 3 to 4 times the seed. Let us now consider in tedious detail the structure and function of medieval villages. Villages were nucleated settlements with houses clustered together. A typical village might have 20 to 100 households. Each household would have a house and perhaps some outbuildings. There would be a small garden plot near the house called a toft. Beyond the village itself would be the fields. These were the large open fields divided into strips. Beyond the fields would be common lands including pastures, meadows and woods. The use of common lands was regulated by custom and tradition. The village operated as a cooperative unit. Major decisions affecting the community would be made collectively at meetings. This collective decision-making required consensus building and compromise. It also meant that individual autonomy was limited. The physical layout of villages meant lack of privacy. Houses were close together, sound, carried. People knew what was happening in their neighbours' houses. Gossip spread quickly. Secrets were nearly impossible to keep. This lack of privacy would be very difficult for modern people accustomed to having their own space. The village church was the centre of community life. The church building was usually the largest and most substantial structure in the village. It was built of stone and had a tower with bells. The interior would have a nave and a chancel. The walls might be decorated with paintings of biblical scenes. The churchyard was the burial ground. Graves would be marked with simple stones or wooden crosses. The graveyard was a reminder of mortality, constantly visible to villagers. Medieval people had a more immediate awareness of death than modern people typically do. The priest was a significant figure in village life. He could read Latin and could read the Bible. He delivered sermons, performed sacraments, and provided spiritual guidance. The church as an institution was enormously powerful and wealthy. Now let's examine medieval diet in even more excruciating detail. Bread was the staple food. The type of bread varied by grain available and by social status. Bread was baked in communal ovens in many villages. Baking required skill. In addition to bread, medieval people ate pottage. Pottage is a thick soup or stew made by boiling grains, vegetables, and sometimes small amounts of meat in water. Pottage was cooked in a pot hung over the fire. The same pot might be kept going for days. Vegetables that could be grown in household gardens supplemented the diet. These included onions, garlic, leeks, cabbage, and turnips. Fruits might be available in some seasons. Nuts were another food source where available. Dairy products were important where available. Eggs from chickens were eaten when available. Fish was eaten, especially on Fridays and during Lent. Meat was rare in peasant diets. When available, it might be pork, chicken, or occasionally beef or mutton. Seasonings were limited. Salt was the most important seasoning and preservative. Other seasonings might include herbs grown in gardens. Expensive spices from Asia were available to the wealthy, but not to peasants. Sweeteners were also limited. Honey was the primary sweetener. Beverages included water, ale, and occasionally wine. Water quality was often poor. Ale was consumed daily by adults and children. Wine was more common in southern regions where grapes grew. This diet, while providing enough calories for survival in most years, was nutritionally deficient by modern standards. It was low in protein, certain vitamins, and variety. A modern person would find the medieval diet intolerably bland and monotonous. Let us now examine medieval clothing in even more detail. Men typically wore a tunic reaching to the knees or mid-thigh. The tunic would be belted at the waist. Under the tunic might be worn brays. Over the tunic, a man might wear a cloak for warmth. On the feet, men God-marked plants with signs indicating their uses. Surgery was practiced but was very limited and dangerous. There were no anesthetics except perhaps alcohol or opium, which provided only limited pain relief. There were no antiseptics or understanding of infection. Surgical instruments were not sterilized. Surgeons did not wash their hands. Simple procedures like setting broken bones or removing bladder stones could be performed. Amputations might be done in cases of severely damaged limbs, though the patient would likely die from blood loss, shock, or infection. More complex internal surgeries were not possible. Childbirth was attended by midwives rather than physicians. Midwives had practical experience but limited theoretical knowledge. They could assist with normal births but had few tools to deal with complications. Maternal mortality was high. If a baby was in a difficult position, or if labour did not progress, there was little that could be done. The mother might labour for days and then die from exhaustion, or she might develop infections and die days after delivery, or she might hemorrhage and bleed to death. These were common occurrences. Infant mortality was also very high. Perhaps 30 to 50% of children died before age 5. They died from diseases, from malnutrition, from accidents. Parents would have many children expecting that some would die. Naming a new baby after a deceased sibling was common. Diseases that are now preventable by vaccination killed many children. Smallpox, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, all were common and deadly. Parents could only hope their children would survive and had no way to protect them. A modern parent transported to medieval times would be constantly terrified for their children's safety. The knowledge that any illness could be fatal, that there was no effective medical care, that the death of children was common and expected, all would be psychologically traumatic. Dental problems were common and painful. Tooth decay would cause toothaches. Abscessed teeth would cause severe pain and swelling. The only treatment was extraction, which was done without anesthesia by pulling the tooth with pliers or similar tools. Having a tooth pulled without anesthesia is extremely painful. The person would have to be held down while the tooth was forcibly removed. Bleeding and pain would continue for days. Infection might develop, potentially spreading to the jaw or even to the brain, causing death. Many people lost teeth young and would have gaps in their mouths or would be missing many or all teeth by middle age. This affected their ability to chew food and their nutrition. It also affected their appearance and speech. Vision problems could not be corrected. Eyeglasses were invented in Italy in the late 13th century, long after the First Crusade, and even then were rare and expensive. People with poor vision simply had to cope with impaired sight. Blindness from disease, injury, or age was common. Blind people would be unable to work effectively and would depend on family or charity. Cataracts, which cloud the lens of the eye and cause blindness, could potentially be treated by a procedure called couching, which involved pushing the clouded lens to the side. But this was risky and not always successful. Hearing loss also could not be treated. People who lost hearing would be unable to communicate effectively in a world without sign language or assistive devices. They would be isolated and disadvantaged. Other disabilities were similarly untreatable. A person who became paralyzed from a spinal injury would be bedridden for life. A person with severe arthritis would suffer constant pain with no relief. A person with a chronic disease would slowly deteriorate with no hope of treatment. Mental illness was poorly understood and often attributed to demonic possession or sin. Treatment might involve prayer, exorcism, or simply confining the person. There was no effective psychiatric. First mechanical clocks were invented in the late 13th century, well after the First Crusade. Before that, time was measured by sundials, water clocks, or simply by observing the sun's position. Sundials work by casting a shadow from a vertical object called a gnomon. As the sun moves across the sky, the shadow moves. Marks on the dial indicate different times of day. However, sundials only work when the sun is shining. On cloudy days, they are useless. Also, the length of daylight hours varies by season, so the hours marked on a sundial are not of equal length year-round. Water clocks, also called clepsydry, measure time by the flow of water from one container to another. They work day and night and in any weather. However, they require regular maintenance and refilling. They are not very accurate because the flow rate can be affected by temperature and other factors. Water clocks were expensive and rare in medieval Europe. For most people, precise time measurement was unnecessary. Activities were governed by natural rhythms: wake at dawn, work during daylight, sleep after dark. Church bells might ring to mark certain hours for prayers, giving a rough sense of time during the day. But the modern obsession with precise scheduling did not exist. This had both advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, life was less regimented and stressful. There were no appointments to rush to, no schedules to coordinate. On the other hand, coordinating activities between people was more difficult. You could not simply agree to meet at a specific time. You had to use vague terms like mid-morning, or when the church bells ring for nones. The canonical hours, used by monks and clergy for prayer, divided the day into 8 segments: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nons, vespers, and compline. These hours were not of fixed duration but varied with the seasons. This fluid concept of time would be disorienting for a modern person accustomed to precise time measurement. Let us examine medieval agriculture in even more exhaustive detail. The agricultural year followed a predictable cycle, but each season brought different tasks and challenges. In late autumn, after the harvest was complete, the fields needed to be prepared for winter crops. Ploughing in autumn was heavy work. The summer had baked the soil hard. Breaking it up required a strong plough and powerful animals to pull it. After ploughing, the field would be harrowed. Harrowing involves dragging a heavy frame with spikes or teeth across the ploughed field. This breaks up large clods of earth and smooths the surface. It prepares the soil for planting. Then came sowing. Seeds would be scattered by hand across the field in a technique called broadcasting. Winter was a quieter time for fieldwork, but not a time of rest. Animals needed daily care. Cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens needed to be fed. Buildings needed maintenance. Tools needed to be repaired. Textile work occupied much winter time. Spinning converted raw wool or flax fibres into thread. Weaving converted thread into cloth. As winter progressed into spring, new agricultural tasks began. Fields that had been fallow needed to be ploughed and prepared for spring crops. Spring crops included oats, barley, peas, and beans. After spring sowing, the crops needed to grow through late spring and summer. Summer tasks included weeding, maintaining irrigation, and watching for pests. As summer progressed toward autumn, harvest time approached. This was the most critical and labour-intensive period of the agricultural year. Harvesting grain involved cutting the stalks with sickles. The cut grain would be gathered into bundles called sheaves. After drying, the sheaves would be transported for threshing and winnowing. The amount of grain produced varied significantly from year to year depending on weather. This variability meant that food security was always uncertain. In a good year, a field might yield 6 to 8 times the amount of seed planted. Care. People with mental illness would be feared and shunned. A modern person with any chronic health condition that requires medication or medical management would be in serious trouble in medieval times. Diabetics would die without insulin. Asthmatics would struggle without inhalers. People with high blood pressure would be at risk of strokes and heart attacks. People with any of countless other conditions would suffer and likely die young. Even healthy modern people would face health risks. The diseases endemic in medieval times would be new to modern immune systems. Bubonic plague, which caused the Black Death pandemic in the 14th century, was spread by fleas on rats. It killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population. There was no treatment and no prevention. Leprosy was another feared disease. It is a chronic infectious disease that affects the skin, nerves, and mucous membranes. It can cause disfigurement and disability. Medieval people feared leprosy and isolated lepers. In special colonies outside of towns, lepers had to ring bells to warn others of their approach. Tuberculosis was common. It is a bacterial infection that primarily affects the lungs but can affect other organs. It causes chronic coughing, fever, weight loss, and eventually death. It spreads through the air when infected people cough. There was no treatment in medieval times. Malaria was common in some regions. It is caused by parasites spread by mosquitoes. It causes fever, chills, and flu-like symptoms, and can be fatal. Quinine, derived from cinchona bark, is an effective treatment, but cinchona is native to South America and was not available in medieval Europe. Countless other diseases and parasites afflicted medieval people. Intestinal worms were very common. They are spread through contaminated water and food and through poor hygiene. They can cause malnutrition and illness. Lice and fleas were ubiquitous. They spread diseases and caused constant itching and discomfort. A modern person would be horrified by the prevalence of disease and parasites and the complete inability to treat them effectively. The constant risk of falling ill and dying would create overwhelming anxiety. Every cough, every fever, every ache would raise the spectre of serious illness. Now let us turn to the topic of medieval warfare and violence in more tedious detail. The medieval period was characterized by frequent warfare between kingdoms, nobles, and other factions. Warfare was brutal and deadly. Medieval battles were fought primarily with handheld weapons, swords, spears, axes, maces, and bows. Fighting was face-to-face and personal. Men would hack and stab at each other until one was dead or too wounded to continue. The noise would be deafening, shouting, screaming, the clash of metal on metal. Armour provided some protection but was expensive. Knights wore chainmail, which is made of interlocking metal rings. Making chainmail was extremely labour-intensive. Each ring had to be individually made and linked to other rings. A full suit of chainmail might contain thousands or tens of thousands of rings. Later, plate armour was developed, which provided better protection. Plate armour consisted of shaped metal plates covering various parts of the body. It was even more expensive and required skilled armourers to make and fit. Common soldiers could not afford such armour. They might have a simple helmet and perhaps a padded jacket called a gambeson. Otherwise they fought with minimal protection. A single blow from a sword or axe could kill or seriously wound them. Archers using longbows or crossbows could rain arrows or bolts on enemy forces from a distance. An arrow could pierce armour at close range. Being hit by an arrow was likely to cause serious injury or death. Even non-fatal wounds could become infected and kill the person days or weeks later. Siege warfare involved attacking fortified positions like castles or walled cities. This could take months. The attackers would